Hello and welcome to Talking Politics Q&A. I'm joined by Robert, and Harry is also with us this week to answer the political questions that matter to you. Let's dive straight in this week. And the big question that we want to get to first is from somebody who just leaves their initials, DD, presumably not David Davis, maybe. He says, she says, why do you give Farage so much airtime when he has just 5 MPs? Harry, you spent a lot of time covering reform. Do you think we're overdoing the reform coverage?
It was a question we always ask ourselves because it's a criticism we often get. And look, there's a lot of factors that go into it. It's not just how many MPs they've got, it's how they performed in the last election. Don't forget they finished third in terms of vote share nationally. It's how they perform in things like council by-elections even. You know, we've seen that over the last 6 months in the run-up to these local elections. They're performing very well on a kind of local level. And then, of course, now, you know, they in these last set of local elections, more than 600 councillors. So there's a lot of evidence there that their electoral performance is sort of matching their performance in the opinion polls. It's also about what reforms say on certain issues. And I think you could argue that they are able to take slightly more extreme positions than the Conservatives in some instances, and the fact they've got something different to say sometimes means that they can insert themselves into a story. And then, you know, on a practical level, I mean, we'll just say this about reform. This is not a factor of why we give them more airtime, but part of their strategy is, as a party, is that they want to be on the media as much as possible. And, you know, Nigel Farage and Richard Tice in particular ensure that they are basically pretty much always available for interviews. Now, critics would say they don't spend enough time with their constituents, or they don't spend enough time doing the sort of dirty work as Parliament in the way perhaps other parties do, but that is a deliberate choice by Reform that they are going to make themselves much more available for media interviews, and that means that, you know, on the occasions where we do decide we want to speak to them, it's the answer from them is almost never no. Whereas from some parties it is. You know, some parties, we sometimes call them up and say, have you got anyone available for a short interview? And they say, I'm really sorry, it's a Friday afternoon, we're all back in our constituencies, you know, doing important work. We haven't got any time. And It's very rare you get that answer from Reform.
Yeah, and Kemi Badenoch, of course, Conservative Party leader, is much more sceptical about media coverage and doesn't do many interviews, quite frankly. Robert, I mean, this is something we think about really carefully, particularly during elections and under the Ofcom code. You know, we have to be really careful what we do during elections and outside elections too. But do you think that, you know, we are sort of slipping into this habit now of going to Nigel Farage for a response rather than, say, Kemi Badenoch? I mean, I noticed last week was it the week before, with the immigration white paper, that media did tend to actually go to Nigel Farage first before they went to Kemi Badenoch. How do we get around that? Because she is still the leader of the official opposition, of course.
So look, the one thing that Harry would have pointed out, but just forgot, was that, you know, Reform is now the most popular party in the UK according to most opinion polls. And you know, if you're in journalism, you can't ignore that. Now, I think your questioner is basically saying that would never have happened if we hadn't given Nigel Farage so much airtime. I mean, what I would say is that actually for years it was inevitable that Farage would attract attention because he was the most consistent and loudest sort of speaker on why we should leave the European Union. And, you know, the Brexit decision in 2016 was arguably the single most important political decision taken by the British people in modern history. So it's not at all surprising that he became a very prominent public figure. I mean, but as a counterweight to all of that, yes, of course, Richard Tice and Nigel Farage and you know, a few others now within the Reform Party get onto political chat shows, you know, like the Peston show. But, you know, I've been at ITV now for almost 10 years, leading our political coverage. And truthfully, I mean, God knows how many, hundreds and thousands of pieces I've done for ITV in that period. I mean, only a small minority of those news bulletin pieces would have featured Farage or, people now at the top of the Reform Party. So I think you shouldn't overstate the enormous, supposedly, the uh, disproportionate attention that they receive. And then finally, plainly, what Reform are doing are tapping into some issues and to a large extent some unhappiness about government that millions of British people feel. And, one, in a sense, corollary or proof of that is 10 days ago, Keir Starmer stood up in front of his MPs in a private meeting and said that as far as he was concerned, Reform were now the main opposition, and Nigel Farage is the main enemy. Whatever the constitutional nicety, that Kemi Badenoch is, in a parliamentary sense, the leader of the opposition. So, when the Prime Minister is saying, the main opposition are Farage and Reform, I mean, of course, all media are going to take Nigel Farage and Reform seriously.
Yeah, it's a pretty strong signal. I mean, on the flip side, we've also got a question from Emma, who says, we've got TDS, Trump Derangement Syndrome in the US. Do you think there's FDS, Farage Derangement Syndrome, in the UK? And my understanding, Harry, is that typically TDS is used as a bit of a joke to kick the left-wing media in America and say that they are overly obsessive about everything that Trump does and overly kind of apocalyptic about everything that Trump does. So I suppose this question is coming from the other side of things, saying maybe we're not positive enough about Nigel Farage. Are we always looking for too many negatives about Reform UK, too many scandals about candidates and councillors or whatever? Are we as scrutinising of other parties as we are of Reform UK?
I think if you asked other parties, I think they'd say we are. Yeah, it's a difficult one. This because Nigel Farage has been such a divisive figure and such a prominent figure in British politics for basically the last 30 years or so. And Nigel Farage himself is sort of quite proud of saying that he wants to be divisive. He wants to have clear opinions on subjects that are different from others. So he kind of relishes this sort of label that is put on him sometimes. I think as we get close to the next election, our job to scrutinise Reform, if, as they say, they're serious about becoming the next government, becomes more and more important. So, people perceive that as sort of Farage Derangement Syndrome, fine. But, there is going to be a lot more scrutiny of Reform. Reform know that, and they sort of say, bring it on. We're quite happy about this. We want more scrutiny. And behind the scenes, their setup, they believe, is getting a lot more professional. I was talking to someone in Reform a couple of weeks ago. This was just ahead of the council elections. And they quite proudly said to me, they said, look, you can look at every flyer we've put out during this local election campaign. You won't see anywhere any promises from any of our candidates about reducing council tax. We're very realistic about the fact that these councils we run now, we might have to put council tax up by 5% or the maximum allowed amount. We're not making pie in the sky promises. Now, I haven't checked that yet, but I'm sure that's the sort of thing that we will start to check. So, they're sort of trying to make themselves a bit more sort of bulletproof because they know that the scrutiny is going to increase and there are going to be more and more questions about them as they try and get ready for government.
Robert, I just want to bring in another question from Nigel Lee on this point of scrutiny. He asks, Labour love to blame the previous government for the mess they inherited, but have done nothing to even slow the rate of decline in the country. How long can they get away with blaming the previous government for their problems? I sort of think about halfway through the Parliament, it starts to get a bit old. What do you think?
Well, I think there are two different issues here. One is when would it be fair to hold the current government totally accountable for the country's problems. And, when you've had, when you come into government 14 years, when, you become a new government after 14 years of, it's true that, the first few years were the Tories in coalition with the Lib Dems, but, basically this has been Tory government for 14 years. That's enough time for the last lot to be responsible for, a lot of the problems we've got, whether it's low growth or stagnating living standards. And, quite a lot of these problems, particularly of growth and living standards, are not easy to fix. So, arguably, as you say, if it were just fairness, you would say, in theory, Labour could blame the Tories for quite a lot longer. I think, though, the politics of it are different from what you might call the fairness or economics. I think people are sick to death of this government blaming the Tories. I think most people think, look, you lucky so-and-sos, you got your dreams come true. You are now in government. This is now, your responsibility. You've got to fix it. Tell us a positive story about the future. We as an electorate have made it clear that we blame the Tories, and my goodness, the electorate are making that clear at the moment, given the Tories are languishing in most polls, in third place, sometimes, with just late teens support, incredibly sort of terrible poll ratings for the Tories. So the British people are saying, yeah, we know much of this is the Tories' fault, but we're looking to you, Labour government, to fix this. So if I had any advice for Keir Starmer, I would broadly say people are sick to death of what they think of as you making excuses when you blame the Tories. Just get on and fix this thing.
And again, I suppose there's an opportunity there for Nigel Farage because, the Labour government's blaming the Tory government. The Tory government, not the government, the Tory opposition can't really come back and criticise Labour yet. It kind of feels too soon. It's too easy to just reply, well, it was all rubbish on your watch. Whereas Nigel Farage is a clean slate, Harry, and he can kind of come along and say you're all rubbish. And Nigel Farage, his criticisms of the Labour government seem to stick a lot more because he doesn't have that past in government himself.
Yeah, that's true. But again, I think that will become. He and his party will develop a record of their own now that they run councils, now that they're controlling two mayoral areas. So they will start to develop a track record in local government that they will have to defend. And you can bet that the other parties are watching their every move in those council meetings to make sure that they bring that up as we get close to the next general election. I was just going to say on how long you can get away with blaming previous governments for. I remember in the run-up to the last general election, Tory ministers kept referencing that note that Liam Byrne left back in whenever it was 2010. There's no money left. So 14 years apparently is as long as you can take to blame the previous government. So I don't think Labour will be shutting up about this anytime soon, despite the fact the public might be sick and tired of it.
Yeah, and actually that argument worked for many years, didn't it, for the coalition government and further into David Cameron's second term in government, Robert?
Yeah, look, particularly, if you're facing pressure, the instinct in politics is, unfortunately, the instinct of many people in life is to blame somebody else. There were sort of two actually very just quick points, though, which are very much sort of related to what we were talking about earlier, as well as this question. One is, if we do in this country suffer from Farage Derangement Syndrome, he should be so lucky. Because, what it reflects, if there is Farage Derangement Syndrome, is that he's pretty much the only politician in the country at the moment, that certainly the only one in Parliament, who excites both incredibly positive and incredibly negative reactions. And in a political world which many would say is dull, that's a mass. So I hope if he's complaining about it, he shouldn't be. And then there's this other issue about holding him to account. It's not just, I mean, I happen to think the media both has and will continue to hold him to account. I have to say, he is slightly disarming. I don't know what you thought, Harry. I was quite struck at his ability to make jokes of some quite serious points. You know, when he was doing his big sort of launch speech, that right at the beginning, he just himself raises the issue of whether he historically has been too close to Vladimir Putin, and he makes a joke of it. And you know, for those, I presume, journalists in the audience, it's quite disarming. But I was just going to say, in terms of holding reform to account, as I say, I happen to think, you know, the media does a better job than we're often given credit for. But frankly, it'll be markets that also hold them to account. If within a year of a general election, it looks as though reform's going to win, and they have not got credible economic policies, we'll all know about it, because, you know, the pound and government debt prices will almost certainly start to fall.
Final question from Sophie, who's emailed in. What are the most difficult or awkward interviews you've ever had to do? I feel sort of guilty revealing these sometimes. I feel like I shouldn't be saying it. It's a bit mean. Harry, do you want to venture somebody that you found particularly awkward or difficult to interview?
Well, I think most politicians are pretty awkward to interview. I think the way that interviews work in politics, that's, you know, you have this sort of slightly,
choreography.
The weird small talk beforehand, and then the silence before you start rolling, all that sort of stuff. I think that probably the most awkward one, the most awkward person I've interviewed, I would say, is Liz Truss. And I interviewed her quite a few times when she was a minister, and then during her leadership campaign. And then when she was briefly when she was Prime Minister as well, I was probably one of the few journalists who got the chance to interview her during that period. But she has this slightly strange thing where she doesn't like any distractions behind the camera. So there was this one interview I was doing with her where she ushered all of her aides out the way from behind me, and we were in this really small room, and she wanted them all out of her eye line so she could only look at me, and I was the only thing in her island, nothing else could distract her.
Saw quite a lot of pressure on you as well.
Yeah, but it meant that this interview that was supposed to last for 2 minutes, and I was only going to ask 3 questions or whatever, because there was nobody behind me to sort of tap me on the shoulder and say, "Come on, hurry up, you know, this is time to be over now." This interview just went on and on and on, and I could ask Liz Truss as many questions as I wanted and sort of skewer her in all sorts of different ways with different questions, and she became more and more uncomfortable, and I could see out the corner of my eye her aides became more and more uncomfortable, but they were sort of helpless to do anything because she had told them to move off to the side. And it just struck me as a kind of a really weird thing for someone to do. And this was just, weeks before she became Prime Minister.
Yeah. The thing I hate, and all governments do this, is when you're doing a pool interview. So for anyone who doesn't know, pool interview is where we do one interview for all the broadcasters to share. And they say to you beforehand, what you're going to ask.
Yeah.
And it's normally a cabinet minister. And I actually said to someone the other day, a press officer, I think they can handle it.
Yeah.
Whatever I'm going to ask, I think they can handle it. They're a very grown-up politician. I'm not going to ask them about the price of milk. I'm going to ask them about a political topic that's on the agenda that day. I've only got 3 questions, allegedly, although we always try and push for more.
Yeah.
I think they're going to be all right. I'd say the most awkward interview I've done, probably with Rishi Sunak when he came back from D-Day, just because of the fallout from it, and trying to handle that during a general election campaign was tricky. He was always perfectly pleasant to interview, Rishi Sunak, but he was quite cross after that interview, and it's sometimes the fallout is actually worse than the interview itself, isn't it?
Yep.
When you're handling all the advisors afterwards who are screaming down the phone at you. Robert, give us yours, please.
Probably too many to mention. I've talked about this before. There was a particular interview I did with Theresa May in Downing Street, where she was obsessed with, I can't even remember what the point was now, but it was some point that she wanted to make about Nicola Sturgeon, who was at the time First Minister of Scotland. And it didn't matter what I asked, she'd memorised a script about Nicola Sturgeon that she just repeated. And those sorts of interviews are so frustrating. They are so annoying. And, I have to say that in many ways, Theresa May now looks like a relatively straightforward, rather principled politician compared to some of those who've gone, who we've seen subsequently. But she was still doing that thing that has damaged trust in, British politics. Viewers absolutely can see when a politician is not answering the question, and viewers hate it, right? And they think much more poorly of any politician who does that. And there was one occasion where I sort of manifested both my frustration and probably the viewers' frustration when she was Prime Minister. In a difficult period, there was a member of her cabinet called Michael Fallon, who was her sort of attack dog, who was always sent out when the government was in a hole, because he not only didn't answer questions, but he didn't answer them in a very aggressive way. And this was when my show was on Sunday, and he came in. I think it was probably during that snap election she called in 2017. Anyway, he was at the end of the show, and it was a really annoying interview. And I thought the cameras were not on me. And right at the end, I sort of banged my head on the table in frustration. And of course, the cameras were on me, and it became, shall we say, a bit of a social media meme.
Everyone's going to be searching for that meme now. Robert, great story. Thank you very much. Harry, thanks to you too. That is all we have time for this week. Don't forget, if you have a question for the team, you can get in touch on social media or by email at talkingpolitics@itv.com. And if you haven't already, you can subscribe on YouTube or your favourite podcast platform to make sure you never miss any episode of Talking Politics. Thank you very much for joining us.